Please be advised. This story contains themes of psychological mystery and suspense, which some listeners may find intense. Listener discretion is advised. David Miller had always prided himself on his meticulousness. Years spent hunched over monitors dissecting pixels, sifting through hours of grainy surveillance footage for the smallest anomaly had honed his vision into something almost preternatural. He could spot a shifted shadow, an unnatural glint, a fleeting reflection that anyone else would miss. But what he found on Tuesday, in the dead quiet of the archives, wasn't an anomaly he could explain away with light refraction or lens flares. It was something else entirely. The case was ancient history, a cold file gathering dust in the back of the precinct's digital vault. The disappearance of Sarah Jenkins, a garden variety missing person from 5 years ago. No body, no ransom, no note, just a vanished woman and an abandoned car on the outskirts of Elmwood. The official conclusion was always the same. She ran off or met with an accident that left no trace. David himself had reviewed the initial batch of footage back then, found nothing, and moved on. Until now. His supervisor, Captain Davies, a man whose skepticism was legendary, had tossed the file onto David's desk with a sigh. "One last look, Miller, before we officially close it forever. Fresh eyes, you know the drill. Anything at all." David had nodded, grimly accepting the Sisyphean task. He didn't expect to find anything. Nobody ever did with Sarah Jenkins. He started with the same old CCTV feed from the corner store on Maple Avenue, the last confirmed sighting of Sarah's car heading out of town. It was a low-resolution, black-and-white stream, recorded by a cheap security camera mounted above the entrance, its lens perpetually smudged. He scrubbed through the hours leading up to Sarah's last known movement, a monotonous parade of late-night shoppers, stray cats, and the occasional passing vehicle. His eyes glazed over, his mind drifting until a flicker, a momentary distortion, yanked him back with a jolt. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a car. It was a tear in the fabric of the image itself. David leaned closer, his breath hitched. He rewound, then played it forward again, frame by agonizing frame. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. And there it was. In one single solitary frame, frame 312. A shadow. Not a shadow cast by light, but a shadow that absorbed light. It was impossibly dark, an inky void, yet it had a discernible, if distorted, shape. It was vaguely humanoid, elongated, thin like a stretched silhouette, but without the crisp edges of a real person. It seemed to be standing just at the periphery of the camera's view, partially obscured by the old oak tree that lined the sidewalk. It was there then gone. A ghost in the machine. His first thought was a technical glitch. Compression artifact. A momentary drop-in signal. Dust on the sensor, maybe. He'd seen it all. David was a master of debunking visual anomalies. He brought up the preceding frame, frame 311. Nothing. Just the empty sidewalk, the flickering street lamp, the familiar static of the poor resolution. He moved to the next frame, frame 313. Again, nothing. Just the empty sidewalk, the flickering street lamp, the familiar static. Only frame 312. He isolated the frame, zoomed in, ran every enhancement filter he had. Noise reduction, sharpening, contrast adjustment. Each attempt only deepened the impossibility. The shadow wasn't pixelated into oblivion. It seemed to hold its form, its impossible darkness, even under intense magnification. It wasn't a smudge of dust. Dust particles would refract light, scatter it. This thing seemed to consume it. It was too structured to be random noise, too precise to be a mere artifact. There was a subtle impression of a head, shoulders, a torso. But it was entirely featureless, a flat two-dimensional cutout pasted onto a three-dimensional world. And its position, it was standing exactly where Sarah Jenkins' car would have been visible just seconds later, before it drove out of frame, heading towards the road where it would ultimately be found abandoned. David felt a cold prickle crawl up his spine. He dismissed it. He had to dismiss it. 5 years of experience told him this was nonsense. His mind scrambled for a rational explanation. A bird flying past at just the wrong moment? But the shape was wrong. A tree branch swaying? No, the branch was static in the preceding and subsequent frames. A trick of the light from a passing car? But no car was visible in frame 312 itself, only the stationary street lamp. He spent the next 2 hours in a state of growing unease, running every diagnostic, cross-referencing with other footage from the same camera, from different days, even different times of day. He pulled up archives from the week before Sarah's disappearance, the week after. He scrutinized every single frame of every single video. He found countless glitches, blips, and artifacts. But nothing, absolutely nothing, resembled the impossible light-devouring entity in frame 312. It was a singular event, a unique imprint. He felt a profound sense of isolation. This wasn't just a technical problem. It was an existential one. He trained his entire career to see the hidden, the overlooked, the minute details that solved cases. But this wasn't a detail. This was the negation of everything he knew about light, shadow, and reality itself. He called Jessica, his colleague, over to his workstation. She was a no-nonsense analyst, equally skilled, but with a healthy dose of cynicism. "Hey Jess, can you take a look at something for me? I think I'm seeing things." Jessica, chewing on the end of her pen, leaned over his shoulder. "Long day, Miller? Found Bigfoot in the parking lot footage." She chuckled, but her eyes narrowed as she saw the enlarged frame 312 on his screen. "Tell me what you see," David said, his voice strangely tight. She squinted, then leaned back slightly. "Looks like a smudge? Or maybe a bad compression block. Old camera, right?" She pointed. "See how the pixels around it are all distorted? It's just noise." "Play it," David urged, rewinding to frame 310. He clicked. Frame 310. Frame 311. Frame 312. Frame 313. Jessica watched the rapid flicker. The shadow appeared, vanished. "Whoa. Hey, that's weird. It's so fast. Blink and you miss it." She paused. "Still probably a glitch. A burst of electromagnetic interference, maybe? Happens with older systems." "But why only one frame?" David pressed. "Why that specific shape? Why can't I replicate it? I've run every test." Jessica frowned, her cynicism wavering slightly. She watched it again several times. "It is unusually distinct for a glitch. Almost solid, like a silhouette. But it can't be. There's nothing there. If it was a person, they'd show up in more frames or at least have some movement." "Exactly," David said, relief flooding him that she at least saw something beyond mere pixels. "It defies logic. It's static, yet it appears and disappears instantly. No entry, no exit. Just there." "So what are you saying?" Jessica asked, a hint of genuine curiosity, and perhaps a touch of unease, creeping into her voice. "That Sarah Jenkins was abducted by a sentient ink blot?" She tried to laugh, but it sounded forced. David didn't laugh. "I'm saying I don't know what it is. But it appeared at 11:47 p.m. Sarah Jenkins' car was last seen around 11:48 p.m., heading down that very street. Her car was found abandoned less than an hour later. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, no footprints in the dirt around the car except her own. Just gone." Jessica stared at the screen, then at David. The playful skepticism had completely vanished from her face. "You think this has something to do with her disappearance?" "I think," David said, his voice barely a whisper, "that everyone assumed Sarah just vanished. But what if something took her? And what if that something left its impossible signature in frame 312? The thought hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. It wasn't just Sarah Jenkins' disappearance anymore. It was the sudden, terrifying realization that the world might contain things that existed outside the laws of physics, outside the realm of human understanding. And one of those things, a light-devouring shadow, had briefly manifested on a grainy surveillance feed, 5 years ago, at 11:47 p.m. in frame 312, and it had been missed. Until now. David looked at the screen, at the impossible void that mocked his every attempt at rationalization. He was alone with this truth, a truth that threatened to unravel not just a cold case, but his very perception of reality. And the longer he stared, the more he felt an unsettling certainty that the shadow, whatever it was, wasn't just an image on a screen. It was watching, waiting. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, a phantom chill tracing its way up his spine. The analytical part of his brain, honed by years of police work, screamed for logic. It was a pixel artifact, a compression error, a trick of light and shadow, an optical illusion born from exhaustion and too many hours staring at a screen. He leaned closer, his eyes aching, trying to dissect the image into its constituent pixels to break the spell. But the more he scrutinized it, the more the rational explanations crumbled. The shadow wasn't a static smudge. As he toggled between frame 312 and the frames immediately preceding and succeeding it, a horrifying realization began to dawn. There was movement, subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A slight shift in its undefined edges, a fractional change in its impossible depth. It wasn't a glitch frozen in time. It was an entity, however abstract, existing within those fleeting milliseconds. He isolated frame 312 again, running it through every enhancement filter his outdated department software offered. Sharpen, denoise, contrast boost. Each attempt only served to deepen the enigma. The shadow refused to yield any recognizable detail. It was pure, unadulterated darkness, a void that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Yet, within that void, he sensed a presence, a form that defied geometry. It wasn't human, not exactly, but it possessed a disturbing suggestion of observation, of intent. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was something else entirely. He pulled up the original file for Emily Carter. 10 years. 10 years since the vibrant 22-year-old art student vanished from her quiet suburban home in Willow Creek. No forced entry, no ransom note, no trace. Just gone. The security footage from the corner store, 3 blocks from Emily's house, had been logged and dismissed within days of her disappearance. It showed mundane street activity from early evening, hours before Emily was last seen. A few cars, a jogger, a couple walking their dog. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that could explain where Emily went. Until now, David remembered the initial investigation. A frantic search, interviews with friends, family, a boyfriend. Theories ranged from a runaway to abduction, but without a single solid lead, the case had slowly faded into the archive, a painful footnote in the annals of unsolved mysteries. He'd reviewed it himself a few times over the years, part of his routine cold case rotation, always with the same disheartening conclusion, a dead end. But frame 312, frame 312 changed everything. The camera, positioned high above the entrance to Willow Creek Grocer, overlooked the main street. The shadow in that single horrifying frame was positioned near the far edge of the street, partially obscured by a lamppost, yet undeniably present. Its impossible darkness seemed to drink in the ambient streetlights, creating a pocket of absolute black against the grainy sepia-toned night. He spent the next 2 days in a self-imposed exile within his dimly lit office, the glow of the monitor illuminating the growing lines of fatigue on his face. He ignored phone calls, pushed aside new assignments, much to the quiet frustration of his colleagues. Frame 312 became his world, his obsession. He meticulously cross-referenced the time code with Emily's known movements that evening, piecing together a timeline that had always been vague. Emily was believed to be home by 8 p.m. This footage was time-stamped at 7:15 p.m. The shadow was there, on the street Emily would have walked just minutes before heading home, or perhaps already had. He replayed the entire segment of footage, not just frame 312 100 times. He scoured every other frame in the file, every other minute of footage from that same camera. Nothing. No other anomaly, no other impossible shadow. This one was unique, singular, a solitary blot on the fabric of reality, appearing for a fraction of a second, then vanishing as mysteriously as it arrived. The isolation of the phenomenon only amplified its unsettling nature. If it were a camera defect, it would be consistent. If it were dust on the lens, it would shift with the wind or appear in multiple frames. But this was an event, a fleeting, silent observation. David started to feel it even when he wasn't looking at the screen. A prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a sense of being watched, even in the fluorescent sterility of his office. He'd glance over his shoulder, half expecting to see a similar, formless void lurking in the corners of the room. He dismissed it as paranoia, the natural byproduct of staring at something so unnerving for so long, but the feeling persisted, a cold, persistent whisper in the periphery of his consciousness. He pulled up old news reports, maps of Willow Creek, satellite images. He tried to understand the geography of that single frame. The lamppost, the street sign, the distant outline of the old oak tree at the corner. And the shadow. It wasn't just on the street. Its position, if interpreted as a living entity, suggested it was observing something specific. Its orientation, its subtle lean, gave the chilling impression that it was focused on a particular point, a path. The path an unsuspecting young woman might take on her way home. A new terrifying thought began to coalesce in David's mind. What if the shadow wasn't a witness to Emily's disappearance, but a participant? What if it wasn't just observing but waiting? The implications were staggering, pushing the boundaries of what he, a rational man of law enforcement, was prepared to accept. This wasn't a human perpetrator. This wasn't even a conventional mystery. This was something else. He zoomed in on frame 312 one last time, pushing the digital magnification to its absolute limit, distorting the pixels into a jagged mosaic. He knew there was nothing more to see, nothing more to glean from this digital ghost. Yet something compelled him. He traced the outline of the impossible darkness, his finger hovering inches from the screen. And then he saw it. Not a new detail, not a clearer feature, but a subtle, almost imperceptible quality within the deepest part of the shadow. It wasn't just black. It was a black that seemed to ripple, to shift, as if containing something restless, something alive. And for a fleeting, horrifying moment, as he stared into that absolute void, he felt an undeniable sensation, a primal chill that seized him to his very core. The shadow, in its profound abyssal darkness, seemed to look back, not with eyes he could discern, but with an intelligent, chilling awareness that pierced through the pixelated screen and settled deep within his own mind. It was a gaze that promised to consume, a silent recognition that spoke volumes without a single sound. And in that moment, David knew, with a certainty that transcended all logic, that this was just the beginning. The shadow was no longer just an image. It had acknowledged him. It had acknowledged him. The words echoed in David's mind, a cold, hard truth that threatened to shatter his very perception of reality. His breath hitched, a sharp, involuntary gasp that felt like a physical blow. He snatched his hand back from the mouse as if the screen itself had burned him, the cursor still hovering over frame 312. The room, moments ago a sanctuary of focus, now felt like an oppressive cage, its walls pressing in, the air thick and heavy. He stared at the monitor, but not at the image of the shadow. His gaze was fixed on his own reflection, distorted and pale in the dark glass of the screen, his eyes wide with a terror that was both profound and utterly illogical. A shadow, a mere anomaly in digital data. How could it acknowledge anything? How could it see him? His mind raced, desperately grasping for any rational explanation. A trick of the light? A glitch in the playback software? An overactive imagination fueled by too many late nights and too much caffeine? He tried to convince himself, to force the fear down, but the memory of that subtle shift, that almost imperceptible turn, was seared into his mind. It wasn't just a flicker. It was a response. David pushed back from his desk, the chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor, the sound jarring in the sudden, profound silence. He stood up, pacing a small circuit in his office, rubbing his temples with a trembling hand. This was absurd. He was a data analyst trained in logic, in patterns, in verifiable facts. Ghosts and sentient shadows were the stuff of fiction, of campfire tales, not forensic video analysis. He needed to prove himself wrong. He had to. Returning to the desk, he forced himself to sit, his hands clammy as he reached for the keyboard. He opened a different video player, one known for its robust error correction and frame-by-frame precision. He reloaded the raw footage, bypassing any previous edits or enhancements he'd made. Frame 312. He typed the number with a shaky finger, pressing enter. There it was. The same dark, indistinct shape in the corner of the abandoned warehouse footage. He zoomed in, pixel by agonizing pixel, until the image was a mosaic of blurry squares. He applied every filter he knew. Sharpening, noise reduction, contrast enhancement, color inversion. He even tried a thermal overlay, hoping to reveal some heat signature, some indication of a physical presence. Nothing. The shadow remained stubbornly indistinct, a void that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. But as he cycled through the filters, applying and removing them in rapid succession, he noticed something else, something he'd dismissed as an artifact before. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor in the surrounding pixels. It wasn't a static image, a perfectly still anomaly. There was a subtle vibration around its edges, as if the air itself was disturbed, or as if the shadow was exerting a minute pressure on its digital environment. It was like looking at a heat haze but without the heat. He paused, leaning closer to the screen, his breath fogging the cool glass. He rewound a few frames, then played them forward agonizingly slowly. Frame 310, 311, 312, 313. The tremor was there. faint but consistent. It wasn't just in frame 312. It was present in the frames immediately before and after, a ripple effect. And in frame 312, when he had consciously focused his attention, when he had felt that inexplicable connection, the tremor seemed to intensify, just for a fraction of a second before settling back down. It was so subtle, so easily dismissed as digital noise, that anyone else would have overlooked it. But David had spent years training his eye to spot the minuscule anomalies, the nearly invisible clues that could unravel a complex case. And this, he realized with a fresh wave of dread, was not noise. It was a signature, a subtle, almost imperatural reaction. He tried to share his discovery. He picked up his phone, his thumb hovering over Sarah's contact. Sarah, his colleague, his friend, the one person who might understand his meticulousness, his obsession with detail. But then he hesitated. How would he even begin to explain this? "Hey Sarah, I found a shadow in some old footage, and I think it acknowledged me. Also, it vibrates the pixels around it when I stare at it." He could almost hear her polite, concerned questions, the subtle shift in her tone that would signal she thought he was losing his mind. He couldn't risk it. Not yet. Not until he had more. He put the phone down, feeling a profound sense of isolation. This was his burden, his secret. He was alone with the shadow. The next few days blurred into an obsessive cycle. David barely ate, slept even less. His apartment, once a place of comfort, became merely a staging ground for his relentless investigation. He projected the footage onto his largest screen, the shadow now a looming pixelated void, almost life-sized. He walked around it, trying to see it from different angles, as if a change in perspective would reveal its true nature. He even tried to replicate the conditions of the original recording, dimming the lights, creating a similar ambient hum in his apartment, hoping to trigger some revelation. He started noticing things, small unsettling things. His cat, Mittens, usually a fearless explorer, began avoiding his office, often standing at the doorway, tail twitching, staring intently at the screen with an unsettling intensity before bolting away. Objects in his apartment seemed to shift, ever so slightly. A book he'd left on his nightstand would be on the floor in the morning. A mug he'd placed on his coffee table would be a few inches to the left. He rationalized it, of course. He was tired, distracted, forgetful. But the frequency of these minor displacements began to gnaw at him. One evening, as he was once again scrutinizing frame 312, his apartment plunged into darkness. The power had gone out. A common occurrence in his old building, yet this time it felt different. The silence that followed the sudden cessation of the hum of his computer and the refrigerator was absolute, heavy, almost suffocating. He fumbled for his phone, its flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the oppressive blackness. As the beam swept across his office, it illuminated the large screen where the footage had been playing. Even though the power was out, even though the screen was black, for a fleeting, terrifying moment David could swear he saw it. The vague, familiar outline of the shadow, a darker void within the already absolute darkness of the dead screen, seemed to shimmer, almost imperceptibly. His heart hammered against his ribs. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, telling himself it was residual image, a trick of his exhausted mind. When he looked again, it was gone. Just the black, inert screen. But the chill that had spread through him was real, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the sudden lack of heating. The power flickered back on a few minutes later, bathing the room in the harsh glow of his monitor. The shadow was back on screen, fixed in frame 312. He stared at it, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just in the footage anymore. It was here in his apartment, in the very air he breathed. Driven by a desperate need for answers, he started researching the footage itself. It was old, from an abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of town, slated for demolition. The cameras had been installed by the previous owners as part of a rudimentary security system before they went bankrupt. The footage was part of a batch of digital detritus he'd been given to analyze for potential structural weaknesses or hidden assets. He pulled up the blueprints of the old complex, cross-referencing them with the camera angles. The camera that captured frame 312 was mounted high in a corner of the main assembly hall. The shadow was in a section of the hall that had once been a storage area for raw materials, a maze of tall, rusting racks and forgotten machinery. It was a blind spot, a place easily overlooked, easily forgotten. But as he studied the blueprints, a detail caught his eye. A small, almost illegible notation on the original architectural schematics, tucked away in the corner of that very storage area. It wasn't on the newer digitized plans, only the faded scanned paper copy. It was a symbol, an old obscure symbol he didn't recognize, accompanied by a single cryptic word, handwritten in faded ink. Vessel. Vessel. The word resonated with an unsettling power. A vessel for what? For whom? And why was it marked only on the original plans, hidden away in the very place the shadow seemed to reside? David felt a new chilling wave of certainty wash over him. This was no mere digital anomaly. This was a deliberate concealment. And the shadow, lurking in frame 312, was inextricably linked to whatever vessel meant. He had to go there. He had to see it with his own eyes. The abandoned complex, the storage area, the place of the shadow. He had to find that vessel. The decision was made with a chilling certainty that settled deep in Michael's bones. He wouldn't just sit there, dissecting grainy footage and cryptic messages from the safety of his apartment. The answers weren't in the pixels. They were in the dust, the silence, the very air of that forgotten place. The abandoned complex called to him, a siren song of dread and desperate curiosity. He had to go. He had to find that vessel. He spent the next few hours in a feverish blur of preparation. This wasn't a casual urban exploration. This was a dive into an unknown that felt increasingly dangerous. He pulled up satellite images, cross-referencing them with old industrial maps. He managed to dig up online relics from a forgotten era when the complex had been a bustling hub of manufacturing. The specific storage area, the one hinted at in the message, was a nondescript building tucked away at the far end of the sprawling property, partially obscured by a stand of overgrown pines. It looked like any other forgotten structure, yet Michael knew with an unsettling conviction that it held the key. He packed a sturdy backpack, a powerful flashlight with extra batteries, a first aid kit, a multi-tool, a portable charger for his phone, a worn pair of work gloves, and a small high-resolution camera. He even included a respirator mask, just in case the air inside was thick with mold or worse. His car, a reliable but unassuming sedan, was gassed up. He left a note for his neighbor Jessica, a kind elderly woman who often checked on him, saying he was going out of town for a few days for a work project. He hated lying to her, but he couldn't risk anyone knowing where he was truly headed. Not until he understood what he was dealing with. The anonymity felt like a shield, however fragile. The drive was long, stretching into the late afternoon. The familiar suburban sprawl slowly gave way to winding country roads, then eventually to unpaved tracks that cut through dense, silent forest. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Each mile deepened the sense of isolation, stripping away the comforting veneer of civilization, until Michael felt utterly alone, a solitary figure venturing into the maw of something ancient and forgotten. The sun began its slow descent, bleeding orange and purple into the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the trees. He pulled off the main track onto a barely visible dirt path, parking his car a good mile from the complex, hidden amongst a thicket of overgrown bushes. He didn't want to leave any obvious trace of his presence. The walk was eerie. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of his boots on dry leaves and the distant call of a bird. The trees loomed, their branches skeletal against the fading light, like watchful sentinels. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck, a phantom gaze, but dismissed it as nerves. He reminded himself that this was just an abandoned industrial site, not some haunted mansion. Yet, the distinct feeling persisted, a subtle hum of unease that couldn't be rationalized away. Finally, the tree line thinned, and the complex came into view. It was a skeletal beast, sprawling across acres of cracked asphalt and overgrown weeds. Rust-colored corrugated metal buildings, shattered windows like vacant eyes, and the skeletal remains of what looked like loading docks stood testament to its former life. A massive, faded sign, barely legible, hung precariously above what must have been the main gate. AEC Industrial Solutions. The acronym meant nothing to him, but the sheer scale of the dereliction was sobering. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt forsaken. Michael approached cautiously, sticking to the perimeter, using the fading light and the shadows it cast to his advantage. He meticulously scanned the area, looking for any signs of recent activity, fresh tire tracks, broken fences, anything that would suggest he wasn't the first or only visitor. Nothing. The neglect was absolute, undisturbed. It had been years, perhaps decades, since anyone had truly cared for this place. He found a section of chain-link fence that had rusted through, twisted away from its posts, creating a convenient, if undignified, entry point. He slipped through, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Inside, the silence was even more oppressive. The wind whistled through broken panes, creating a mournful, almost human sigh. He navigated the labyrinth of decaying buildings, guided by the crude map he'd sketched, his flashlight beam cutting a path through the encroaching gloom. Dust motes danced in the fading shafts of natural light that filtered through the grime-streaked windows. The air was thick with the smell of decay, metal, and something else, a faint, almost metallic tang he couldn't quite place. He finally reached the storage area, the building that had stood out on the satellite images. It was larger than he'd anticipated, a long, low structure with no windows, just a single heavy-looking steel door, its paint peeling in strips like sunburnt skin. The door was secured with a massive, rust-encrusted padlock. It looked formidable, but Michael had come prepared. He pulled out a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters he'd borrowed from his friend, David, under the guise of needing to cut through some old fencing. The metal shrieked in protest as the jaws bit down, a sound that echoed unervingly in the vast silence. With a final satisfying clunk, the padlock snapped, tumbling to the ground. He gripped the cold steel handle, hesitated for a moment, then pushed. The door groaned open with a tortured screech, revealing nothing but absolute blackness within. He switched on his powerful flashlight, its beam piercing the void. The interior was a cavernous space, much larger than it appeared from the outside. Rows upon rows of towering metal shelves stretched into the darkness, many of them empty, others laden with forgotten crates, tarpaulin-covered mounds, and decaying machinery. The air was colder here, stagnant, and the metallic tang was stronger, almost acrid. Michael stepped inside, the dust puffing up around his boots with each step. His flashlight beam swept across the shelves, illuminating cobwebs as thick as gauze, the skeletal remains of insects, and the heavy pall of time. He was looking for anything out of place, anything that hinted at the vessel or the shadow. The message had been specific: Frame 312 vessel storage. He knew the shadow was in Frame 312, and it was linked to the vessel, which was in this storage area. He walked slowly, methodically, his senses on high alert. He checked the floor for fresh tracks, the shelves for disturbed dust. Most of the items were clearly ancient, undisturbed for decades. But then he saw it. Tucked away in a corner, behind a stack of rusted barrels, was a section of shelving that looked different. The dust here was thinner, disturbed. And on the floor, barely visible beneath a thin layer of grime, were distinct drag marks, leading from a cleared space on the concrete floor towards a wider, empty aisle. His heart pounded. This wasn't just neglect. This was deliberate. Someone had been here recently. Someone had moved something heavy. He followed the drag marks, his flashlight beam fixed on the floor. They led to a large rectangular patch on the concrete, cleaner than the surrounding area, as if something substantial had rested there for a long time, shielding the floor beneath it. It was roughly the size of a large industrial crate or a specialized piece of equipment. This had to be it. This was where the vessel had been. But it wasn't here anymore. It was gone. A cold dread seeped into Michael's stomach. If the vessel was gone, what did that mean? Had someone taken it? Was it related to the disappearance of the delivery driver, Chris Peterson? And the shadow in Frame 312, was it a witness? Or something else entirely? He felt a sudden intense chill, not from the cold air, but from a profound sense of unseen presence. He spun around, his flashlight beam sweeping frantically through the vast, dark space. Nothing. Just the silent shelves, the dusty crates, the echoing emptiness. Yet the feeling persisted, a heavy, watchful weight. He moved closer to the cleared patch of floor, kneeling to examine it. The drag marks were clear, leading away from the cleared space. And then he saw it, almost invisible in the faint light reflected from his beam. Scratched into the concrete near the edge of the cleared rectangle, as if hastily etched by something sharp and metallic, were three distinct symbols. They weren't letters, not numbers. They were angular, almost geometric, forming a crude, unsettling pattern. One looked vaguely like an inverted triangle, another a jagged lightning bolt, and the third a distorted, almost skeletal representation of an eye. They were small, no bigger than his thumbprint, but they pulsed with an unsettling energy. A silent scream etched into the concrete. His blood ran cold. These weren't random graffiti. They felt deliberate, a message, a warning. He carefully took out his camera, snapping several high-resolution photos of the symbols and the cleared space. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to get out, to breathe fresh air, to escape the oppressive weight of this place. The vessel was gone, replaced by these chilling symbols. And the shadow that had been in frame 312, was somehow connected to this empty space, to these disturbing marks. He knew with absolute certainty that he had just stumbled onto something far more sinister than a simple missing person case. He wasn't just looking for Chris Peterson anymore. He was looking for an explanation, for the truth behind the shadow, and for whatever terrifying secret these symbols guarded. And he was very, very alone. The air grew perceptibly colder, and he could have sworn he heard a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, just at the edge of his hearing, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very shadows themselves. The whisper was not a word, not a recognizable sound, but a confluence of air currents and something far more sinister, a vibration that seemed to pluck at the very strings of his sanity. Michael froze, every muscle taut, his breath catching in his throat. He strained his ears, peering into the oppressive darkness that seemed to press in from all sides, his flashlight beam cutting through it like a fragile sword. There was nothing, yet the feeling of an unseen presence was overwhelming, a cold dread that settled deep in his bones. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, his hand instinctively reaching out, brushing against the rough, cold stone wall. The whisper seemed to recede, then resurface, not behind him but ahead, drawing him deeper into the subterranean lair. His heart thumped a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of fear and reluctant curiosity. He had come too far to turn back now, not with the answer to frame 312 potentially lurking just beyond his reach. The air here was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying wood, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood. His beam danced over the intricately carved symbols, now seeming to pulse with a malevolent energy in the flickering light. They weren't just decorative, they were warnings or perhaps guardians. He followed the faint, almost psychic pull of the whisper, his boots crunching softly on scattered debris. The passage narrowed, forcing him to turn sideways, his shoulders scraping against the rough-hewn rock. The whisper grew stronger, no longer just a sound, but a feeling, a low thrum that vibrated through the very soles of his feet. It led him to a section of the wall that looked subtly different. The stones here were smoother, more carefully joined, almost too perfect compared to the ancient, uneven masonry surrounding them. He ran his gloved hand over the surface, his fingers searching for a seam, a crack, anything that might indicate a hidden mechanism. And then he found it. Not a crack, but a slight indentation barely perceptible, where one of the carved symbols seemed to dip inward. It was a spiral, identical to a smaller symbol he'd seen etched on a page in the old journal Jessica had found. He pressed it cautiously at first, then with more force. Nothing. He tried twisting it, nudging it, pushing it from different angles. Still nothing. Frustration mingled with the creeping dread. He stepped back, shining his light over the entire section of the wall. What was he missing? He remembered the journal, the cryptic notes, the idea of a sequence. He re-examined the symbols around the spiral. There were 3 distinct symbols, each repeated twice, forming a pattern. He tried pressing the spiral again, then one of the repeated symbols, then another. A faint click echoed through the chamber, almost drowned out by the pounding of his own blood in his ears. He froze, his breath held captive. The wall before him, the seemingly solid stone, began to retract, not swinging open, but sliding inward with a low, grinding groan, revealing a deeper, absolute blackness beyond. The air that rushed out was colder still, carrying with it a distinct, earthy smell, and something else he couldn't quite place, a faint, almost medicinal tang. Michael hesitated, his flashlight beam piercing the newly revealed void. It wasn't a small alcove. It was another passage, even narrower, leading downward into what felt like the very bowels of the earth. The whisper was undeniably stronger here, a low guttural murmur that resonated directly in his chest. He took a deep breath, steeling himself, and stepped through the opening. The passage descended steeply, the floor uneven and slick with moisture. The symbols continued here, carved into the rough rock at irregular intervals, but they were different now. Less intricate, more primal, almost desperate. They looked like warnings or pleas. He saw crude depictions of figures with outstretched arms, eyes wide with terror, and an ominous repeating symbol that resembled a jagged, broken circle. He continued his descent, the silence broken only by his own ragged breathing and the ever-present, unsettling whisper. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a small circular chamber. This room was different. It wasn't natural rock. The walls were lined with meticulously cut, dark stone, smooth and cold to the touch. In the center, on a raised stone pedestal, lay a single, ancient, leather-bound book. His beam settled on it, illuminating its cracked spine and faded cover. It was clearly very old, perhaps centuries. He approached it cautiously, his heart hammering. This felt like the heart of the mystery, the place where answers were kept. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly, and carefully opened the book. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, filled with a script he didn't recognize. It wasn't English, nor any modern language he knew. It looked like a series of complex symbols, intertwined with a few familiar numerical sequences. But as his eyes scanned the pages, he noticed something else, something that made his blood run cold. Interspersed throughout the ancient script were rough, hand-drawn sketches. And one of those sketches, crude yet undeniably accurate, depicted the very image from frame 312, the distorted figure, the blurred background, the sense of motion and terror. It was all there, rendered in faded ink. Below the sketch, a sequence of symbols was meticulously drawn, symbols identical to the ones on the wall outside. And next to them, scrawled in what looked like a later edition, in a different, more familiar hand, were a few words barely legible. The veil thins. They watch. Frame 312 is the key. Protect the site. Michael's mind reeled. The veil thins. They watch. It sounded like something out of a horror novel, yet here it was in an ancient text connected directly to his digital anomaly. Protect the site. What site? The footage? His own perception? He flipped through more pages, his eyes scanning for anything he could understand. There were more sketches, increasingly disturbing. Figures with elongated limbs, shadows with glowing eyes, rituals performed under a moonless sky. And everywhere those symbols repeated, modified, evolving. He saw dates too, written in what appeared to be a standard calendar system, stretching back hundreds of years, each date accompanied by a single chilling word: appearance. This wasn't just old lore. It was a record, a chronicle of something terrifyingly real. The whisper in the room seemed to intensify, wrapping around him, no longer just a sound, but a presence, a tangible chill that seeped into his very bones. He felt an intense pressure, as if unseen eyes were scrutinizing his every move. He was no longer just an investigator. He was an intruder, prying into secrets that were never meant to be disturbed. He looked closer at the frame 312 sketch. It was accompanied by a longer passage in the ancient script, but below it, in the same familiar hand as the warning, was a single cryptic sentence. The camera sees what the eye cannot. The static is the gateway. The camera sees what the eye cannot. The static is the gateway. This was it. This was the connection. Frame 312 wasn't just a glitch. It was a window. A window to what? To them? The entities alluded to in the text, the ones who watch, the ones who appear. Michael felt a surge of adrenaline, mixed with pure, unadulterated terror. He had stumbled upon something far grander and more terrifying than a simple digital anomaly or a forgotten piece of history. This was a hidden reality, a secret war between dimensions, or perhaps between worlds. He thought of David, the tech genius, dismissing it as a fluke. He thought of Jessica, her fascination with the strange, and Emily, her chilling silence surrounding the footage. They were all connected, unknowingly, to this ancient, horrifying truth. He carefully closed the book, the leather creaking softly, and placed it back on the pedestal. He needed to get this information out, to analyze it, to understand it. But as he turned to leave, a faint glimmer caught his eye, hidden beneath the pedestal. It was a small, ornate wooden box, no larger than his palm, intricately carved with the same recurring jagged circle symbol. He picked it up. It felt strangely warm, almost alive. He tried to open it, but there was no visible latch. He ran his fingers over the carvings, searching for a mechanism, remembering the spiral symbol he'd pressed earlier. He noticed a small, almost invisible indentation on one side, shaped like a miniature version of the spiral. He pressed it. With a soft thunk, the lid sprang open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single object. It was a shard of obsidian, perfectly smooth and polished on one side, jagged and raw on the other. But it wasn't just any obsidian. When he picked it up, a faint internal light seemed to pulse within its dark depths, a soft ethereal glow that cast dancing shadows on the walls. And as he held it, he felt a strange sensation, a dull hum behind his eyes, a momentary blurring of his vision, as if he were seeing the world through a distorted lens. He looked at the obsidian shard, then back at the ancient book. "Protect the sight," the warning had said. Was this the sight? A tool, a key, a protective charm? Or something far more dangerous? The whisper in the room was no longer just a murmur. It was growing, coalescing, sounding less like a whisper and more like a collective sigh, a mournful exhalation that filled the small chamber. The air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The ethereal glow of the obsidian shard intensified slightly in his hand, as if reacting to the burgeoning energy around him. Suddenly, a distinct sound broke through the oppressive atmosphere. It wasn't the whisper. It was a faint metallic clink from the passage he had just come through, followed by a soft, almost imperceptible scrape. Someone else was here. Someone had followed him or perhaps had been waiting. His blood ran cold. He wasn't alone anymore. The symbols, the book, the shard. He had disturbed something ancient and powerful. And now, whoever or whatever guarded these secrets was here. He extinguished his flashlight, plunging the chamber into near total darkness, save for the faint, pulsing glow of the obsidian in his hand. He pressed himself against the cold stone wall, his heart pounding a frantic drum solo against his ribs. The metallic clink came again, closer this time, followed by the soft, distinct sound of a footstep. It was deliberate, heavy, not an echo but a living presence. A shadow had entered his sanctuary, and it wasn't the one from the footage. It was real, and it was coming for him. His breath hitched, a jagged shard of ice in his throat. Every muscle in David's body locked, rigid, a statue carved from terror. The sound, that undeniable heavy footstep, resonated not just through the floorboards but deep within his bones, rattling the very foundations of his sanity. This wasn't a phantom, not an echo of his overactive imagination. This was real. A presence, deliberate and cold, now shared his space, his sanctuary, transforming it into a hunting ground. The air in the office grew thick, heavy with an unseen weight. David squeezed his eyes shut for a split second, a futile attempt to make it disappear, to rewind the last terrifying minute. But when he opened them, the darkness remained impenetrable, and the silence that followed the single footstep was even more menacing than the sound itself. It was the silence of anticipation, of a predator listening, sensing. Then another sound, faint but distinct, reached him from the hallway. A soft creak, the subtle groan of an old floorboard giving way under pressure. It was closer now, just outside his office door. David instinctively pressed himself further back into the worn leather of his chair, trying to become one with the shadows, to shrink into nothingness. His hand, clammy with sweat, fumbled for the edge of his desk, searching for anything, a pen, a paperweight, a weapon. His fingers closed around the cold, smooth casing of his external hard drive. The very object of his obsession, now a clumsy, inadequate defense. His mind raced, a frantic hamster on a wheel of panic. Who? How? He had locked the doors, double-checked the windows. This wasn't a random break-in. The deliberate nature of the footsteps, the chilling silence, suggested something far more sinister, something targeted. Was it connected to the footage? Had he pushed too far? Had they found him? A sliver of light, almost imperceptible, appeared at the bottom of his office door. Not from behind it, but from under it. A faint, cool blue glow like the dim light of a smartphone screen. The intruder wasn't just lurking. They were actively searching, perhaps even using a device. David's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum solo of fear. He held his breath, praying his ragged exhalations weren't audible above the deafening roar in his ears. The blue light shifted, then vanished. A soft click, the sound of his doorknob turning. Slowly, deliberately, David's blood ran cold. He couldn't move. His body had betrayed him, frozen in place, a deer caught in headlights. The door began to open, a barely audible whisper of wood against frame. A deeper shadow, a towering silhouette, began to fill the doorway. It was tall, broad-shouldered, not a random opportunist. This person was here with purpose. He could feel the cold radiating from the open doorway, A chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The figure didn't immediately step in. They paused just on the threshold, their presence a palpable weight pressing down on David. He couldn't make out features, just the imposing outline against the dim ambient light from the hallway, which was barely enough to define the shape. Then a low guttural sound, almost a sigh, escaped the intruder. It wasn't aggressive, not yet. More like disappointment, or perhaps careful observation. David realized they likely hadn't seen him yet. Hidden as he was in the deepest part of the room, behind his desk, swallowed by the darkness. This was his chance. A desperate, fleeting window. He had to move. Now. With a surge of adrenaline that burned through his veins, David pushed himself up, sending his chair scraping loudly across the wooden floor. The sound was deafening in the silence, a thunderclap that shattered the fragile stillness. The silhouette in the doorway recoiled slightly, startled. "Who's there?" David's voice came out as a strangled croak, barely a whisper, but it was enough. The figure moved then, swift and silent, stepping fully into the room. David saw a glint of something metallic in their hand, catching the faint light. He didn't wait to identify it. Panic, raw and primal, took over. He lunged, not at the intruder, but towards the far wall, towards the window. It was his only escape. He crashed into his bookshelf, sending books tumbling to the floor with loud thuds. The intruder was behind him, closer now, their heavy footsteps echoing the frantic rhythm of his own heart. David scrambled, his hands fumbling with the window latch. It was old stiff. His fingers were shaking so violently he could barely grip it. A hand, gloved and surprisingly strong, clamped down on his shoulder. David cried out, a sound ripped from the depths of his fear. He twisted, elbowing backward with all his might, connecting with something solid. A grunt of pain escaped the intruder. It was enough. The grip loosened for a fraction of a second. David yanked the latch open, shoving the window upward with a desperate heave. Cold night air rushed in, a sudden, blessed reprieve from the suffocating terror of the room. He didn't hesitate, didn't think twice about the two-story drop. He swung his legs over the sill, ignoring the sharp pain as his knees scraped against the frame. He heard a frustrated curse from behind him, a low, gravelly voice he didn't recognize. "Stop!" But David was already halfway out. He pushed off the sill, dropping blindly into the darkness below. The fall was jarring, impacting hard on the damp earth beneath the window. A sharp pain shot up his leg, but he ignored it, scrambling to his feet. He was out. He was free. Or was he? He didn't look back. He ran. Across his overgrown lawn, through the sparse bushes, his pajama pants snagging on thorns, the cold night air biting at his exposed skin. He could hear sounds from the house, a window slamming shut, then the frantic thud of footsteps from inside. They weren't pursuing him from the window. They were going through the house, likely to the front or back door. They knew his house. They knew the layout. David veered left, heading towards the neighboring property, hoping to lose himself in the shadows of their unkempt garden. His chest burned, lungs screaming for air, but he pushed harder. The image of that metallic glint in the intruder's hand flashed in his mind, fueling his desperate flight. A weapon? Or something else? He didn't want to find out. He burst through a hedge, stumbling onto the manicured lawn of his neighbor, Mrs. Henderson. Her house was dark, silent. Of course. She was an early sleeper, usually in bed by 9. It was well past midnight. No help there. He kept running, adrenaline pumping, a desperate prayer forming on his lips. He needed to get to his car. It was parked on the street, a few blocks away, hidden from the house. He always parked it there, a habit from his days of trying to avoid street sweeping tickets, but now it felt like a stroke of genius, a lifeline. As he pounded down the quiet residential street, the cold air stinging his face, a sudden realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. His hard drive, the one with all the footage, all his research, all his notes. He had been holding it when the intruder grabbed him. He must have dropped it. No, he knew he had dropped it. He remembered the cold metal slipping from his grasp as he struggled. It was back in his office. With them, a fresh wave of terror, colder and more profound than the fear for his own life, washed over him. The hard drive contained everything. The raw footage, the zoomed-in frame 312, his meticulous analysis, the cryptic messages he'd found hidden in the company's archived reports. If they had it, if they had his hard drive, then all his work, all his discoveries would be in their hands. and they would know exactly how close he was to unraveling their secrets. He thought about turning back. The thought was fleeting, instantly extinguished by the memory of that imposing silhouette, the metallic glint. He was no match for them. He had to think, to plan. But first he had to survive. He reached his car, a beat-up sedan that had seen better days. His hands fumbled with the keys, shaking so badly he dropped them once, cursing under his breath. He bent down, scooped them up, and jammed the key into the lock. The click of the mechanism was agonizingly loud in the silent night. He wrenched the door open, practically falling into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. His breath came in ragged gasps. He fumbled for the ignition, twisting the key. The engine sputtered, groaned, then finally caught. A wave of relief, so potent it almost brought him to tears, washed over him. He jammed the car into reverse, tires squealing softly as he backed out, then sped down the street, away from his house, away from the terrifying shadow that now occupied it. He drove aimlessly at first, his mind a chaotic whirl of fear and adrenaline. Where could he go? Who could he trust? The police? What would he tell them? Someone broke into my house, and I think it's because I found a shadow in a corporate video. And they might have my hard drive, which proves it all? They think he was crazy, or worse, they might be involved. The thought chilled him to the bone. He needed to think clearly, to formulate a plan. He needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere he could process what had just happened. His phone. He reached into his pocket. It wasn't there. He must have left it charging on his desk. Back in the house, with the hard drive, he was cut off, isolated. His mind flashed back to the footage, to the unnerving stillness of frame 312, to the vague, distorted outline of the shadow. Was the intruder the same shadow? Or a different one, a more corporeal manifestation of the threat? The voice he'd heard, low and gravelly, didn't match any of the voices from the video. But then the video was old, grainy. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. He had to get to Emily. She was the only one who knew about his research, who had seen the footage, who believed him. She was his confidant, his partner in this increasingly dangerous obsession. But going to her house might put her in danger too. He couldn't risk that. He needed a neutral ground, a public place, somewhere he could think without constantly looking over his shoulder. A diner, a gas station, somewhere with people, with light. He drove for what felt like hours, the city lights a blur through his tear-filled eyes. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They had his hard drive, they had his research, but they didn't have him, and they didn't have the knowledge in his head. He still remembered every detail, every connection, every unsettling piece of the puzzle. They wanted to silence him, to stop him from exposing whatever truth lay hidden in that footage. But now, it wasn't just about uncovering a corporate secret. It was personal. They had invaded his home, threatened his life. They had taken his work. David knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wasn't going to stop. Not now. Not ever. This wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was a war. And he was going to fight. He just needed to figure out how. He pulled into an all-night diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where the coffee was perpetually brewing and the fluorescent lights hummed with a tired energy. He parked at the furthest end of the lot, his instincts screaming caution. He needed to be seen but not observed. Stepping out of the car, the cold night air still bit at his skin, but the fear had sharpened into something else, determination. He was alive. He had escaped, and now he had to figure out his next move. The shadow in the footage had found a way to reach out from the screen, to manifest in his reality, and it had just stolen his most vital weapon. He was starting from scratch, but with a burning resolve he hadn't known he possessed. The game had changed, and David was ready to play. David stood in the unsettling stillness of his apartment, the absence of his laptop a gaping maw in the room's familiar layout. The silence that followed the shadow's disappearance wasn't empty. It was heavy, suffocating, pregnant with the entity's lingering presence. His burning resolve, a fierce protective fire, flickered against a sudden chilling draft that seemed to seep from the very walls. He moved first to his desk, running his trembling fingers over the smooth, cool surface where his laptop had rested mere moments ago. No dust disturbed, no scratch marks. It was as if the device had simply dematerialized. He checked the floor under the desk behind the monitors. Nothing. Not a single cable left dangling. Not a power brick abandoned. The theft was eerily clean, surgically precise. Then he moved to the door. He checked the deadbolt, the chain lock. Both were securely fastened, just as he remembered leaving them. No pry marks, no forced entry. He peered through the peephole, then slowly opened the door, scanning the empty hallway. The old building's usual creaks and groans were the only sounds, amplified by his racing pulse. No one. Nothing. This wasn't a break-in. This was something far more insidious. The entity hadn't broken in. It had simply entered. It hadn't stolen. It had taken. The distinction sent a fresh wave of dread through him, but it was quickly overshadowed by a cold, hard determination. If the entity could manifest physically, then he could confront it in the physical world. He began a methodical search of his apartment, not for the laptop itself. He knew it was truly gone, but for any trace, any anomaly left behind. He started in the living room, moving slowly, his eyes scrutinizing every surface, every shadow. He checked under the couch cushions, behind the bookshelves, even inside the seldom-used fireplace. Nothing seemed disturbed, yet everything felt wrong. The air was different, thinner, charged with an invisible energy. In the kitchen, he opened cabinets, checked the pantry. The mundane objects of his daily life sat undisturbed, mocking the chaos in his mind. He found himself sniffing the air, searching for an unfamiliar scent, a metallic tang, a chemical residue, anything to confirm that something other had been here. All he got was the faint, stale smell of his own apartment, mixed with the phantom scent of ozone that had plagued him for days. He moved to his bedroom, his heart hammering against his ribs. This was his sanctuary, his last refuge. He checked the windows, ensuring they were still locked, their seals intact. He pulled back the curtains, letting the dim evening light spill into the room, chasing away the oppressive shadows. He looked under the bed, in his closet, behind the dresser. Still nothing. The meticulous order of his life, a testament to his increasing paranoia, remained unbroken. But then, as he knelt beside his bed, something caught his eye. Not on the floor, but on the underside of his nightstand. A faint, almost imperceptible smudge. It was dark, a greasy, sooty mark, no bigger than his thumbprint. He reached out, his finger hesitating before touching it. It felt cool, slightly tacky, and smelled faintly of burnt electronics, a smell he'd come to associate with the entity's digital intrusions. This was it. Physical proof. A tangible mark left by an intangible threat. The smudge wasn't like ordinary dust or grime. It had a strange, almost shimmering quality when he angled it in the light, a hint of deep, unnatural violet within the blackness. It was a scar on his reality, a signature of the entity's trespass. He carefully scraped a tiny sample onto a piece of paper, folding it securely. It wasn't much, but it was something. It confirmed his terrifying suspicion. The entity wasn't just manipulating his digital world, it was actively reaching into his physical one. And it had left a mark, however faint. His mind raced. If it could leave a smudge, what else could it do? What was its purpose in taking the laptop? Was it merely to silence him, to destroy the evidence? Or was there a darker, more active intent? The laptop contained the original footage, yes, but also all his research, his theories, his desperate attempts to understand. It was his entire investigation condensed into a single device. He thought about his phone. It was still in his pocket, untouched. He pulled it out, almost expecting it to be dead, or bricked, or displaying some new horrifying message. But it was normal, its screen glowing with his default wallpaper. The entity's focus had been singular. The laptop. He needed to access the internet to find a way to analyze this smudge, to research anything remotely similar. But without his laptop, his primary tool, his options were severely limited. He couldn't risk using Michael's computer. He'd already pushed his friend too far, and Michael would dismiss his claims as delusion. Public libraries? Internet cafes? Those were options, but they were public, vulnerable. He needed discretion, security. The thought of his old, dusty desktop PC, tucked away in his storage closet, flickered into his mind. It was ancient, slow, barely capable of running modern software, but it was his. It was offline, untouched by the entity's previous digital assaults. It might be his only safe option for now. He dragged the heavy tower out, blowing off layers of dust. The monitor was a bulky CRT relic, the keyboard yellowed with age. He spent the next hour meticulously cleaning it, reconnecting the cables, and finally, with a deep breath, pressing the power button. The old machine groaned to life, a cacophony of whirs and clicks, its fan struggling against years of accumulated grime. As the familiar, outdated operating system slowly loaded, David's mind was already churning through possibilities. He couldn't access his cloud backups from this old machine. They were linked to his stolen laptop's account. But he could start fresh. He could use this machine as a clean slate, a safe haven from which to begin rebuilding his understanding. He thought back to the footage to frame 312. The shadow. It had been a fleeting glimpse, a distortion, but it had been the catalyst for everything. Now that shadow had stepped out of the screen and into his home. It had taken his weapon, but it had also made a mistake. It had left a trace. The smudge. He pulled out the folded paper, carefully examining the dark, shimmering residue. It wasn't just burnt electronics. There was something organic about it, a faint metallic scent mixed with something else, something primal and unsettling, like damp earth and cold iron. This wasn't merely a digital entity. It was something that could interact with the physical world, leave a mark, perhaps even feed on it. He needed to find out what this smudge was. He needed to research electromagnetic interference, paranormal manifestations, forgotten sciences, anything that could possibly explain its existence. He needed to understand the rules of this new terrifying game. The entity had escalated. It had made itself real. And in doing so, it had given David a target. His resolve hardened further. He wasn't just fighting an abstract digital threat anymore. He was fighting a physical intruder, a tangible enemy. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was now tempered by a fierce, almost primal anger. It had invaded his home, stolen his work, and threatened his sanity. He would not back down. He opened the ancient web browser, its interface clunky and slow. His first search would be simple: unexplained residue after electronic theft. He knew it was a long shot, but he had to start somewhere. The entity had shown him its hand, revealing a terrifying new dimension to its power. But in doing so, it had also given him a new kind of clue, a physical anchor to its presence. The game had indeed changed. It was no longer a battle confined to screens and data streams. It was a fight for his reality, for his sanity, and perhaps for his very life. And David, armed with a single inexplicable smudge and an unwavering will, was ready for the next move. He would follow this dark trail, no matter where it led. He had to. He had to. The next few days blurred into an obsessive haze. David retreated deeper into the confines of his apartment, the outside world fading into a distant hum. His only companions were the glow of his monitor and the haunting image of frame 312. He pored over it, hour after hour, a man possessed. He cycled through every digital enhancement tool known to man, and then some: sharpening algorithms, contrast filters, color inversion, noise reduction, even obscure spectral analysis programs he'd found buried in academic forums. Each attempt was met with the same frustrating result. The smudge remained stubbornly indistinct, a void that seemed to absorb light and detail, mocking his efforts. It wasn't just a flaw in the old tape, he realized. It wasn't a compression artifact, or a dust particle, or a lens flare. As he zoomed in, pixel by agonizing pixel, he began to perceive a peculiar, almost organic irregularity to its edges. It wasn't a smooth, uniform blotch. It had a shape, a non-Euclidean geometry that defied easy categorization. It was like looking at a perfectly camouflaged predator, its form just beyond the grasp of the eye, yet undeniably there. He started to think of it less as a smudge and more as a hole in reality, or perhaps a perfectly cloaked entity designed to be unseen, yet caught for a fleeting instant by his childhood camcorder. The isolation began to warp his perception. His phone would ring with unknown numbers, only to hang up the moment he answered. His internet connection, usually stable, flickered erratically, pages failing to load or displaying fragmented data. At night, the quiet hum of his apartment was punctuated by faint, almost imperceptible scratching sounds from his attic, or sometimes from within the walls themselves. He dismissed them as old house noises, then find himself holding his breath, straining to hear them again. He started to feel a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the inexplicable certainty of being watched, even alone in his living room. He began to cover his windows with thick blankets, convinced that unseen eyes were peering in. His once rational mind was fraying at the edges, stretched taut by the relentless pressure of his discovery. He knew he couldn't do this alone, Not with the specialized analysis this anomaly seemed to demand. But who could he trust? The police would laugh him out of the station. Official channels were out of the question. He still couldn't shake the feeling that this went far deeper than a simple missing person case. He needed someone with unconventional skills, someone who wouldn't immediately dismiss him as delusional. Then a name surfaced from the depths of his memory: Sarah Miller. Sarah, an old friend from his college days. She was a brilliant, eccentric computer science major, always delving into obscure data analysis, cryptography, and the fringes of information theory. While others were coding basic apps, Sarah was dissecting complex algorithms and building her own. She had a reputation for solving impossible digital puzzles, and a healthy, almost defiant skepticism for authority and conventional wisdom. She was the perfect blend of genius and rebel. If anyone could peer into the digital abyss of Frame 312 and see something others couldn't, it was Sarah. He found her contact information after a frantic search through old emails and social media. She still worked in tech, running a small independent data forensics firm. A cover, he suspected, for her true passion of unraveling digital mysteries. He sent a cryptic email, hinting at an old, personal project that had taken an unexpected turn, requiring her unique expertise. To his relief, she responded, expressing cautious interest and suggesting they meet in person. They met at a quiet, unassuming coffee shop on the outskirts of the city, a place David chose for its anonymity and sparse clientele. Sarah, with her dark, intelligent eyes and a perpetually curious expression, looked largely unchanged, though a few streaks of silver now threaded through her dark hair. He ordered 2 black coffees, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the USB drive containing Frame 312 on the table between them. He started cautiously, recounting the story of his childhood footage, the old camcorder, the strange glitch. He omitted the more fantastical elements, focusing instead on the technical anomaly. He showed her the raw image of Frame 312 on his laptop, pointing to the indistinct smudge. "It's just there," David explained, his voice hushed. "Only for that single frame. My old VCR didn't register it as a tracking error. No other frames around it are affected. I've run every filter, every enhancement I know, but it just stays a blur, a void. But I feel like there's something more to it." Sarah leaned closer, her brow furrowed in concentration. She studied the image intently, her fingers tracing invisible patterns in the air. She murmured, a common intellectual tic of hers. "It does look like a compression artifact, or perhaps some magnetic interference on the tape. But the consistency, for just one frame and then gone, that's unusual even for old analog." She asked for the raw footage, not just the screenshot. David handed her the USB drive. "I digitized the entire tape, frame by frame, at the highest possible resolution," he explained. "I wanted to preserve every detail." Sarah nodded, her eyes already scanning the drive's contents. "Good. Raw data is always best. Let me take this back to my lab. I have some specialized spectral analysis algorithms I've been developing. They might be able to tease out something conventional filters can't." She gave him a reassuring, if slightly skeptical, smile. "Don't get your hopes up, David. Old media can be notoriously fickle." But David saw the flicker of intrigue in her eyes. She was hooked. 2 days later, his phone rang. It was Sarah. Her voice was taut, devoid of her usual easygoing tone. "David, you need to come to my office. Now. And don't tell anyone you're coming." His heart hammered against his ribs. He knew. He absolutely knew. He arrived at her compact, high-security office, located in an anonymous industrial park. Sarah met him at the door, her face pale, her usual composure replaced by a bewildered intensity. She led him into her back lab, a room filled with humming servers and multiple monitors displaying complex data streams. On the largest screen, Frame 312 filled the display, but it was profoundly different. The smudge was no longer a mere blur. Sarah had layered it with multiple spectral overlays, revealing faint, almost imperceptible patterns of light and shadow within its depths. They were arranged in a fractal-like, non-Euclidean geometry, constantly shifting, like looking into a kaleidoscope that twisted and reformed, but always returned to a disturbing, underlying order. It was like a window into another dimension, just barely visible through the veil of digital noise. "It's not an artifact, David," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Her finger trembled as she pointed to the screen. "It's a structure, a signature. This isn't just a void, it's something cloaked. My algorithms are picking up energy readings, faint but distinct, at frequencies that shouldn't be present in standard video data. It's like looking at a ripple in water, but the ripple is made of pure darkness, and the water is light itself. She zoomed in further, pushing the limits of the resolution. It's designed to be unseen, she continued, her voice growing hushed with awe and fear. It exists on a different frequency, barely registrable to conventional sensors. But your old camcorder, in that specific light at that precise moment, somehow caught a glimpse of its distortion field. Its footprint. The implication settled over David like a shroud. This wasn't just about his childhood memory, or a single frame of footage. This smudge, this shadow, was evidence of something extraordinary, something that defied known physics, and it had been there in his backyard all those years ago. If it was there then, what else was it doing? Where else had it been? And where was it now? Sarah, her face still pale, pointed to a tiny repeating symbol she had managed to extract from the fractal patterns. It pulsed faintly, a complex geometric shape that David vaguely recognized, a symbol that resonated with a distant, unsettling familiarity. He had seen it before but couldn't quite place it. It was a symbol that shouldn't exist, a key to a door he never knew was there. The very air in the lab seemed to chill as the full terrifying implication settled over them. The very air in the lab seemed to chill as the full terrifying implication settled over them. Eris's breath hitched, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The symbol, a complex, almost organic fractal sigil that pulsed with a faint internal light on the monitor, was not just a random anomaly. It was a pattern, a blueprint, a signature. And he knew it. Or rather, he knew of it. The recognition was a slow-burning fuse in his memory, igniting a forgotten corner of his academic past. A place he had deliberately sealed off years ago. "No," he whispered, the sound barely audible, his eyes still fixed on the screen, reflecting the strange ethereal glow of the sigil. "It can't be." Sarah, sensing the profound shift in his demeanor, leaned closer, her voice laced with concern. "Dr. Thorne? What is it? What do you recognize?" Eris finally tore his gaze from the screen, turning to Sarah, his face pale, etched with a mixture of dread and disbelief. "The labyrinthine key," he murmured, the words tasting like ash. It was a theoretical construct, pure speculation, fringe science, dismissed as pseudoscience by virtually every reputable physicist and mathematician of the last century. He began to pace the small lab, his hands running through his already disheveled hair. "When I was a graduate student fresh out of my PhD, I stumbled upon a set of obscure, privately published papers. They weren't peer-reviewed, they weren't even widely circulated. They were the work of a reclusive collective, self-proclaimed metaphysical cartographers, who believed that certain geometric patterns, when rendered in specific energy frequencies, could act as a key to manipulate the fabric of reality itself. They called it the labyrinthine key, a way to unlock hidden dimensions, to tune reality, to facilitate what they termed transdimensional displacement." Sarah stared at him, her brow furrowed. "Transdimensional displacement? You mean like teleportation? Or something crazier?" "Crazier," Eris confirmed, a grim, humorless smile touching his lips. "They hypothesized that these patterns could open localized, temporary portals, not just through space, but through the very structure of existence. They believed these keys could be used to excise or integrate matter from one reality into another, to make things disappear or appear." He stopped pacing, his eyes meeting Sarah's. The entire concept was fascinating, terrifying, and utterly unprovable. It bordered on the occult, even for a theoretical physicist like me. I spent months obsessing over those papers, trying to find a flaw, a logical inconsistency. I found many, or so I thought. The math was complex, riddled with assumptions that seemed impossible to verify. Eventually, I dismissed it as brilliant, albeit delusional, fiction. A thought experiment, nothing more. I tucked the papers away, convinced they were a dead end, a rabbit hole leading nowhere. But now, Sarah gestured to the screen, where the fractal sigil continued its soft, rhythmic pulse. "Now it's in surveillance footage from a missing persons case. And you're telling me it's a key to manipulate reality?" "This isn't just a key," Eris corrected, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This is the key, or a variation of it. The specific arrangement of lines, the subtle energy signature, the way it seems to distort the light around it. It matches the descriptions in those papers almost perfectly. The shadow in frame 312 isn't just a distortion, Sarah. It's the effect of this labyrinthine key being activated. It's not a shadow of something, it's a shadow from somewhere else. A profound silence descended upon the lab, broken only by the hum of the computers. The implications were staggering, stretching far beyond anything they had conceived. This wasn't a criminal investigation, or even a scientific anomaly. This was something that defied their understanding of the universe. If this is true, Sarah said, her voice strained, if this symbol can actually displace people, then Emily and Michael aren't just missing. They've been taken out of our reality, and whoever activated this labyrinthine key, they know how to do it. Eris nodded slowly, the weight of the realization pressing down on him. And they're doing it repeatedly. The pattern of disappearances, the lack of evidence. It all fits. No forced entry, no struggle, just people vanishing into thin air. Because they're not vanishing into thin air. They're vanishing from thin air. From our dimension. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of memory, obscure diagrams and cryptic notations from those long-forgotten papers. The collective, they believed the key wasn't just a theoretical construct. They believed it could be built, manifested, that certain frequencies, certain materials, certain conditions could make it real. They were trying to find a way to make it permanent, stable. And the shadow? Sarah asked, her finger pointing to the blurry, dark mass in frame 312, now made even more terrifying by this new context. The papers described the initial stages of activation as causing localized temporal and spatial distortions, Eris explained, his voice gaining a frantic edge. Brief, fleeting moments where the barrier between realities thins. The shadow would be the visual manifestation of that thinning, a glimpse of the elsewhere bleeding through, or perhaps even the energy signature of the key itself in its active state. The disappearances would occur at the peak of this distortion. He walked back to the main console, his fingers flying across the keyboard, pulling up various archival databases, searching for labyrinthine key, metaphysical cartography, transdimensional displacement. The results were sparse, mostly philosophical treatises, a few debunked internet forums, and the occasional science fiction reference. The original papers he'd read were almost impossible to find now, having been largely self-published and then suppressed or simply forgotten. This is not something you just stumble upon, Eris said, his eyes scanning the screen. This knowledge, if it's real, would be guarded, hidden. The collective that wrote those papers, they were paranoid, secretive. They believed their work was too dangerous for the public, that it could unravel the very fabric of society. They referred to themselves as the architects of the veil. The architects of the veil, Sarah repeated, a shiver running down her spine. The name itself felt ancient, ominous. So, someone out there isn't just using this key, they've mastered it. And they're using it to make people disappear. But why? That was the ultimate question the papers never fully answered, Eris admitted, his voice heavy. They hinted at a grand design, a reshaping of reality, but the specifics were always vague, couched in philosophical riddles. They believed humanity was imprisoned by its current dimensional constraints, and that the key offered liberation. But liberation for whom? And at what cost to those who are excised? He paused, a new thought striking him with chilling force. Wait, the papers mentioned something else. A resonance signature. Each key, once activated, would leave behind a subtle, unique energetic imprint, a kind of echo in the local space-time, a way to track its previous activations, if you knew what to look for. Sarah's eyes widened. You mean the symbol itself could be leaving a trace? Like a fingerprint? Exactly, Eris said, his mind now fully engaged in the puzzle, despite the terror it evoked. If we can isolate that resonance signature, if we can find other instances of it, we might be able to map out where and when the key has been activated. It's a long shot, but it's the only lead we have. He quickly opened a new spectral analysis program, feeding in the enhanced data from frame 312, instructing it to search for residual energy patterns, specific harmonic frequencies associated with the labyrinthine key's activation. The computer word processing the complex algorithms. As the program ran, Eris's gaze drifted back to the screen, to the pulsating fractal sigil. It wasn't just a picture. It was a promise and a threat. A promise of unimaginable power, and a threat of utter annihilation of what they understood as reality. The shadow in the footage wasn't just a shadow. It was the edge of an abyss. The architects of the veil, Sarah murmured again, lost in thought. They were trying to build this key. What if they succeeded? What if they're still out there perfecting it? If they are, Eris said, his voice grim, then Emily and Michael and all the others are just the beginning. They're testing the limits, refining their methods. And we've just stumbled into their workshop. He remembered a particularly disturbing passage from one of the papers, a cryptic warning about the unintended consequences of wielding such power. The authors had hinted that repeated, uncontrolled activations of the key could lead to dimensional bleed-through, where elements from other realities could spontaneously manifest in their own, or where the very fabric of their world could become unstable. Suddenly, a series of pings erupted from the spectral analysis program. Data streams began to fill the screen, lines of code flashing rapidly. "It's found something," Sarah exclaimed, leaning in. "Multiple resonance signatures. Faint but distinct. And they're not just in the vicinity of Emily and Michael's disappearance." Eris's heart pounded in his chest. "Where?" The program displayed a map, overlaying a series of red dots across the United States. Each dot represented a location where a similar, faint resonance signature had been detected, matching the unique energetic fingerprint of the labyrinthine key. The dots were clustered, not randomly, but in specific unsettling patterns. Some were near other unsolved missing persons cases, others near known energy anomalies, and a few were in places that seemed utterly unremarkable. "These aren't just isolated incidents," Eris said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is a widespread, coordinated operation. They've been activating the key for years, all over the country, and no one has noticed until now." One cluster of red dots particularly caught his eye. It was centered around a small, remote town in rural Pennsylvania, a place he hadn't thought about in decades, a place he had hoped to never think about again, a place where his own family had roots, and where a strange, unexplained event had haunted his childhood. It was a place where a local legend spoke of people simply vanishing into the woods, never to be seen again. A place where his grandmother had always warned him about the whispers from beyond the trees. The full, terrifying implication settled over them. They weren't just looking at a pattern, they were looking at a map. A map of incursions. A map of a war being waged on reality itself, and somehow Eris was personally intertwined with its origins. The full, terrifying implication settled over them. They weren't just looking at a pattern, they were looking at a map. A map of incursions. A map of a war being waged on reality itself, and somehow Eris was personally intertwined with its origins. The silence that followed was heavy, a suffocating blanket of dread. Emily, typically the most outwardly emotional, was pale, her eyes wide and fixed on the glowing map. Jessica, ever the pragmatist, was already scrolling through data, her fingers a blur on the trackpad, but even her movements seemed to carry a new, frantic energy. David was slumped back in his chair, his usual confident smirk replaced by a look of profound disbelief, as if the very foundations of his logical world had just crumbled. Michael, however, felt a cold surge of clarity. This wasn't merely a disappearance anymore. This was a cataclysm, and Eris was at its epicenter. "Origins," Michael repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "What does that even mean? Was he just a witness or a participant?" Jessica paused her frantic scrolling, her gaze snapping to Eris's meticulously kept journal, which lay open on the table. He was always pushing boundaries, wasn't he? Not just observing anomalies, but trying to understand their fundamental nature. What if he didn't just find the door, Michael? What if he opened it? David scoffed, though the sound lacked its usual conviction. Opened a door to what? Interdimensional invaders? Cosmic horror? Come on, Jess, this is Eris we're talking about. Brilliant, yes, but not a god. Emily shook her head slowly. No, not a god. But maybe a key. Think about it. Frame 312. That wasn't just a random anomaly. It was a direct interaction. The shadow, it wasn't just passing through. It was responding to him, to his presence, his awareness. The words hung in the air, chilling them to the bone. The single flickering frame of Eris's footage, the one that had started this entire nightmare, suddenly seemed less like a glitch and more like a pivotal moment. The first contact, the first shot fired in this war. If he opened it, Michael pressed, leaning over the journal, then there must be a way to close it, or at least a way to understand what he did. He looked at the map again. This map, it's not just showing where they are. It's showing where they were. And where they're going. Jessica nodded, her analytical mind already shifting gears. Exactly. The incursions are not random. They follow a trajectory, a pattern of escalating frequency and intensity. And the points of origin, they all seem to radiate outward from a central nexus. She zoomed in on the holographic projection. And that nexus, it's right here. She pointed to a glowing red, pulsing ominously in the center of the United States. Eris's last known location. His lab. A collective gasp went through the room. Eris hadn't just vanished from his lab. His lab was the epicenter of this escalating global phenomenon. He didn't just disappear, Emily whispered, her voice trembling. He was consumed. Or, he became part of it. David, now fully engaged, pulled up satellite imagery of Eris's isolated research facility. There's no physical damage. No crater, no energy signature that FEMA or any other agency would have picked up. Whatever happened, it wasn't a conventional event. Because it's not a conventional war, Michael stated, his resolve hardening. It's a war on reality, on perception, on the very fabric of existence. And Eris, in his pursuit of truth, somehow became the focal point. He picked up Eris's journal again, flipping through the pages, now seeing the frantic scribbles and complex equations with an entirely new lens. Before they were abstract theories, now they were a desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable. He was trying to warn us, Jessica said, her voice tight. Or he was trying to understand how to fight back. Look at his later entries. They become less about observation and more about manipulation, about influencing the anomalies. They spent the next few hours in a feverish dive, cross-referencing Eris's journal entries with the patterns on the incursion map. Michael focused on Eris's philosophical musings, searching for clues about the metaphysical nature of the threat. Jessica delved into the mathematical equations, trying to find a common denominator, a signature frequency or wavelength. David, with his unparalleled tech skills, reanalyzed every byte of data from Eris's computers, searching for hidden files, encrypted messages, anything Eris might have left behind as a last resort. Emily, with her intuitive understanding of human behavior, scrutinized Eris's personal notes, looking for any shift in his mental state, any sign of what he truly believed he was facing. As the hours bled into the next day, the picture began to sharpen, terrifyingly so. Eris hadn't just observed the anomalies, he'd found a way to interact with them. His research, initially focused on theoretical physics and quantum mechanics, had veered sharply into what could only be described as applied metaphysics. He wasn't just trying to see the shadows, he was trying to touch them. He developed a hypothesis, Jessica announced, her voice strained, pointing to a series of complex diagrams in the journal. He believed that these incursions weren't from another dimension, per se, but rather distortions within our own, like ripples spreading through the fundamental code of reality, and he thought he could create a counter-frequency, a sort of reality anchor, to stabilize localized distortions. David's head shot up. A reality anchor? What would that even look like? A device, Michael said, flipping to a page with a crude schematic. He called it the chronostabilizer, a highly localized field generator designed to resonate with the fundamental frequency of our reality, effectively pushing back against the incursions. Emily gasped. He wasn't trying to open a door. He was trying to build a shield. Or a weapon, Jessica corrected grimly, against whatever was pushing through. And the map, it shows that after he started developing this, the incursions intensified. It wasn't just a passive observation anymore. He poked the bear. David's fingers flew across his keyboard, accessing Eris's old schematics from a hidden partition he just uncovered. He wasn't just building it. He completed it. There are test logs. He ran simulations. He believed it worked. So why isn't he here? Michael asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. If he built a weapon, why didn't it save him? Jessica zoomed in on the map again, overlaying a new layer of data, the timestamps of Eris's final experiments. Because the weapon might have been what attracted the full attention of whatever this is. The incursions didn't just intensify, they began to focus, converging on Eris's lab with alarming precision in the days leading up to his disappearance. Michael's eyes widened. It wasn't a random attack. It was a targeted strike. Eris became a threat, and they came for him. And the shadow in frame 312, Emily added, her voice barely audible. That was just a scout probe, the first sign that they knew he was watching. And then when he started to fight back, they sent the cavalry. David meanwhile had found something else. A final encrypted video log from Eris, dated just hours before his disappearance. It was short, grainy, and filled with static, but Eris's face, haggard and terrified, was unmistakable. They're not just distorting reality, Eris whispered from the screen, his voice laced with desperation. They're consuming it, piece by piece. And I touched something, unlocked something. My stabilizer, it's not enough. It's drawing them in. They want the core, the source. He coughed, a ragged sound, and then his eyes, wide with a horrifying realization, locked onto the camera. They're not just after my device. They're after me, my unique resonance. I'm a conduit, the origin point. I brought them here. The video flickered, and then Eris's gaze drifted past the camera, his eyes suddenly filling with an unspeakable terror. A faint, formless shadow began to writhe in the background, growing larger, more substantial, just like the one in frame 312, but now it was consuming the entire frame. They're here, Eris choked out, his voice barely a whisper. They found the weakness. The bridge. It's me. The screen went black. The silence that followed was even heavier than before. A profound, chilling emptiness that seemed to echo the void Eris had described. Michael, Jessica, David, and Emily exchanged horrified glances. The full, terrifying truth was laid bare. Eris wasn't just intertwined with the origins of this war. He was the origin. His unique perception, his genius, his very essence had somehow become a beacon, a weakness, a bridge for these entities to enter their reality. His chronostabilizer, meant to be a defense, had instead become a lure, attracting the full force of the incursions directly to him. The map of incursions, glowing ominously, now showed a single massive convergence point. Eris's abandoned lab. It wasn't just a location anymore. It was ground zero. And the patterns of the incursions, the accelerating frequency, the increasing intensity, it wasn't just a war being waged. It was an invasion, and Eris was the gateway. He didn't just disappear. Emily finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. He's still there. Or part of him is. He's the anchor, the source they want to fully exploit. If Eris is the source, Michael said, his mind racing, a terrible plan forming, then we have to go back to the source. We have to go to his lab. Jessica stared at him, her face grim. To do what, Michael? Fight something that consumes reality? If Eris, with his device, couldn't stop them, we retrieve the chronostabilizer, Michael interrupted, his voice firm, though his heart pounded in his chest. If it draws them in, maybe it can also push them out. Or at least buy us enough time to understand how to sever the connection, how to close the bridge that Eris inadvertently became. He looked at each of them, his gaze resolute. Eris didn't just leave us a warning. He left us a weapon. And a target. We have to go back to frame 312. We have to go back to where it all began. The silence that followed Michael's declaration was heavy, thick with the weight of everything they had endured, everything they had lost. But beneath it, a flicker of something new ignited: purpose. A desperate, terrifying, yet undeniable purpose. Back to frame 312. Emily echoed, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking the words too loudly might summon something unwelcome. But what exactly are we looking for? What did Eris do? Michael walked over to the main monitor, where the infamous footage of Eris's last moments still glowed faintly. He paused it on frame 312, the eerie, distorted image of Eris's face, eyes wide with terror and something else, something like a horrific understanding, filling the screen. The faint, almost imperceptible shadow was there. A smudge against the wall, a ripple in reality itself. Eris wasn't just observing, Michael began, his voice gaining strength. He was interacting. He was trying to understand the entity, yes, but he was also trying to fight it. He believed this thing lived in the spaces between, in the unseen currents of information and belief. And where did it first truly manifest, truly anchor itself to our perception? He gestured to the screen. Here, frame 312. This isn't just where it appeared. It's its point of entry, its weak spot. Jessica nodded slowly, her eyes fixed on the screen. He was always talking about digital anchors, how our reality was built on layers of data. He said if something could breach those layers, it could be pushed back through them. David, ever the pragmatist, leaned forward. So, Eris thought he could reverse the portal? Trap it back in the data stream? More than that, Michael replied, turning back to them. He didn't just think it. He worked on it. Remember the corrupted files? The data anomalies that didn't quite make sense? The strange code snippets in his journal that didn't seem to belong to any known programming language. Emily's eyes widened. The entropic feedback loop notes. I thought they were just theoretical ramblings about quantum computing, trying to find a way to stabilize reality itself against perceived anomalies. But what if they weren't about stabilizing reality, but destabilizing the entity within it? Exactly, Michael confirmed. Eris wasn't trying to build a shield. He was trying to build a trap. A digital cage, woven from the very fabric of the data stream it used to manifest. David was already at his workstation, fingers flying across the keyboard. If he built a digital trap, it would have to be embedded, hidden, probably within the specific metadata of the original footage. Something that would only trigger under precise conditions. Something only Eris would know how to activate. Or something he left clues for, Jessica added, pulling out Eris's final, almost illegible journal. She flipped through pages, her brow furrowed in concentration. He kept going back to the concept of resonance. How a specific frequency, a specific pattern of data, could create a localized disruption field. He called it the anti-signature. Anti-signature, Emily mused. A digital blank space, a void that actively repels or even erases the entity's presence? Precisely, Michael confirmed. And the trigger for this anti-signature, Eris believed, was rooted in the exact moment of its manifestation. Frame 312. It's not just a frame, it's a key. A switch. David's fingers paused. I'm seeing some highly encrypted, self-modifying code attached directly to the frame data for 312. It's complex. It's almost alive. Like a digital parasite Eris engineered. It seems to be designed to analyze the specific energy signature of the anomaly, and then generate a counter-frequency. Can you activate it? Michael asked, his voice taut. David hesitated. It's volatile. Eris's notes suggest it needs to be fed a specific input, a kind of conceptual anchor to lock onto the entity. Without it, it could just corrupt the entire data stream or worse, open up even more doors. Jessica's eyes fell on a drawing in Eris's journal. It was crude, almost childlike, but undeniably depicted the shadow entity. And next to it, a series of symbols she recognized from Eris's more esoteric research notes. Ancient sigils, symbols of binding and containment, mixed with mathematical equations. The conceptual anchor, she murmured. Eris wasn't just dealing with data. He was dealing with belief, with the power of human perception. He wasn't just building a digital trap. He was building a psychic one, encoded in the digital. Emily leaned over. He was trying to make the entity believe it was being contained. He was creating a mental cage, reinforced by digital code. But how do we provide that anchor? Michael pressed. What is the input? Jessica pointed to a specific symbol in Eris's drawing. A distorted circle with a jagged line through it. Underneath, Eris had scrawled a single word. Closure. It's not a data input, Michael. It's a focus. Eris believed that the entity fed on chaos, on fear, on the openness of our minds. To close the bridge, we have to project an absolute, unwavering intention of closure. Of finality. Of ending. Michael looked at them, a grim understanding dawning on his face. So we have to collectively project the will to trap it, while David activates the digital countermeasure. It's a massive risk, Emily warned, her voice tight. If our focus wavers, if the entity senses weakness, it could turn the feedback loop against us. It could use our own minds as the conceptual anchor to its reality. It's the only shot we have, Michael said, his gaze firm. Eris spent his last days building this. We owe it to him. And to everyone else this thing might touch. They gathered around David's workstation. On the main monitor, frame 312 glowed. A silent, menacing portrait of the entity's initial breach. David prepared the activation sequence for Eris's embedded code. Jessica held Eris's journal open to the page with the binding symbol. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, steeling herself. Michael placed his hand on David's shoulder, a silent gesture of support and resolve. All right, David breathed, his fingers hovering over the final key. When I hit enter, the program initiates. It'll try to establish a lock on the entity's signature. That's when we need to focus. Absolute mental clarity. Intent of closure. Imagine it being pulled back, contained, sealed away. A cold dread seeped into the room. The air grew heavy, thick with unseen pressure. The lights in the lab flickered erratically, casting dancing shadows across their faces. A low, guttural murmur seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a sound that wasn't quite a whisper, not quite a growl, but something in between, designed to pry at the edges of their sanity. "Now," Michael commanded, his voice cutting through the rising tension. David hit the key. Immediately, frame 312 on the screen began to warp. The subtle shadow on the wall intensified, growing darker, deeper, twisting into a more defined, horrifying shape. It pulsed like a digital heart, radiating an oppressive wave of pure, unadulterated terror. The temperature in the room plummeted, and they could see their own breath in the frigid air. Whispers flooded their minds, not spoken words but insidious thoughts, doubts, fears. Asterisk, you cannot contain me. I am everywhere. I am nothing. I am you. Asterisk, Jessica gasped, clutching Eris's journal to her chest. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the screen, but her gaze seemed to pierce through it, locking onto something beyond. "Closure," she cried, her voice strained but resolute. "Go back. Be contained." Emily's face was pale, but her jaw was set. She focused, her brow furrowed in intense concentration, visualizing a barrier, a wall, an impenetrable seal. David, despite the tremors running through his body, kept his eyes on the code, monitoring the feedback loop. The numbers on his secondary screen were spiking, indicating a massive energy drain, a struggle between Eris's program and the entity. Michael stood firm, his eyes narrowed, projecting every ounce of his will. He imagined a vast, empty void, pulling the shadow back into itself, sealing it. He felt an agonizing pressure behind his eyes, a sensation of his own mind being stretched to its breaking point. The shadow on the screen began to writhe, retracting, as if being pulled by an invisible force. It shrieked, a sound that echoed not in their ears, but in the deepest parts of their souls, a sound of pure ancient agony and rage. The lab equipment groaned, sparks flew from outlets, and the main monitor flickered violently, threatening to give out. Suddenly, the shadow surged forward, seeming to lunge directly out of frame 312. A cold, formless tendril of absolute darkness shot towards them. David cried out, recoiling, but Michael grabbed his arm, forcing him to stay focused. "Hold!" Michael roared, his voice raw. "Focus! It's trying to break free. Pull it back." Jessica, tears streaming down her face, chanted, "Closure! Closure! Closure!" Her voice was a desperate mantra against the encroaching darkness. Emily's hands were clenched, knuckles white, her entire being focused on the mental image of an unbreakable cage. The tendril of shadow hesitated, wavered, then slowly, agonizingly began to recede. It was fighting, twisting, thrashing against the unseen pull. The digital feedback loop on David's screen turned from red to a searing white, indicating maximum power, maximum strain. The shadow, now a swirling vortex of blackness, was shrinking, being sucked back into the very point from which it had emerged. It collapsed in on itself, an implosion of pure void. And then, with a final heart-stopping flicker, it was gone. Frame 312 stabilized. The image of Eris's terrified face was still there, but the shadow, the distortion, the ripple in reality, it was gone. The wall behind Eris was just a wall. The digital anomaly had vanished. The lab lights stopped flickering, settling into a steady hum. The oppressive cold began to recede, replaced by the normal, slightly stuffy air of the room. The whispers ceased. Silence. A profound, echoing silence. They stood there, breathing heavily, trembling. David slumped against his chair, wiping sweat from his brow. Jessica dropped Eris's journal, burying her face in her hands, sobbing with a mixture of grief and immense relief. Emily slowly opened her eyes, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. Michael walked to the monitor, staring at frame 312. It was just a frame now, a still image. The terror was gone, replaced by a haunting emptiness. It's gone," David whispered, his voice hoarse. "The program, it completed its cycle. The anti-signature stabilized. It's sealed." They spent the next hours in a daze, meticulously checking Eris's systems, verifying that the unique code had indeed fulfilled its purpose and then self-destructed, leaving no trace of its existence beyond the now ordinary footage. The digital signature of the entity, which had once permeated Eris's network, was completely absent. The bridge was closed, but the experience had left an indelible mark. They had stared into the abyss, and for a terrifying moment, the abyss had stared back. They had seen something that defied explanation, something that lived in the liminal spaces of reality, and they had fought it back. Jessica eventually collected herself. She picked up Eris's journal, running her fingers over the cover. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew what he was facing, and he found a way." Emily, still pale, looked at Michael. "What do we do now? How do we go back to normal?" Michael looked at each of them, his friends, his unlikely allies in a war no one else would ever believe. "We don't," he said quietly. "We can't. We've seen too much. But we carry the truth. We honor Eris's sacrifice by ensuring that no one else has to face what he did. We've closed this bridge. We make sure it stays closed." He glanced back at the monitor at frame 312. It was just an image now, a moment frozen in time. But they knew its secret. They knew the shadow it once held. And they would never forget. The world might never know what lurked in the unseen frames of reality, but they did. And that knowledge, a chilling, profound secret shared only among them, would bind them forever. The shadow was contained, but the echo of its presence, and the courage it took to face it, would forever be etched into their souls.